In particular, we were interested in how the process of land assembly, the dislocation of existing users, and the common representation of the site as a wasteland, which others have touched on a little this morning, by the LDA and ODA, related to conceptions of regeneration and legacy. Depicting the site as a wasteland formed an important strand of assembling the case for going ahead with the CPO, which could only be approved, it could be shown to be necessary to facilitate regeneration and therefore in the public interest. And it also reflects a broader assumption that following the decline of industry, regeneration would involve the promotion and expansion of post-industrial sectors of the economy, such as services, that would hence solve the problems that post-industrial areas have faced since the 1970s. I think this assumption is particularly well expressed in this little excerpt from the Planning Inspector David Rose's report, which was published in 2005, and I'm just going to read that out. The general character of the Lower Lee Valley is one of environmental, economic and social degradation. This is due to historic land use patterns, the fragmented urban structure, a high proportion of strategic utility services, deficiencies in the provision of amenities, and limited opportunities for the local population. The area suffers from a high level of socioeconomic deprivation. Wards in and adjoining the Lower Lee Valley are generally within the 10% most deprived in England, with some in the 5% most deprived. In economic terms, the quality and perception of the physical environment creates a negative image which depresses land and property values while also raising development costs and therefore affecting the viability of redevelopment opportunities. And as it goes on, there's another paragraph that follows on from that, which describes those historic land use patterns as past uses. So the idea that there was clearly a social life in the wasteland, that those uses were past rather than part of a possible regeneration future. Those uses were, as we'll show in the talk, incredibly varied and included a range of different business activities. Deborah and Marion's photographic research involved taking in the order of 10,000 photographs documenting the industrial life of the site, concentrating particularly on 70 of its small to medium scaled enterprises. And I'm just going to show you a few of those from that enormous body of work. This is a scenery builder. There were several of those. This is taxi repairs on the left, and an example of one of the tailoring businesses on the right. Another one of those making leather products, particularly belts. Printing, there were a number of print businesses on the site, and they were had a history going back to the early 20th century when there were a lot of print ink manufacturers and paint manufacturers and the like on the site. Food wholesale here on the right. Sorry, missed that one. Fish smoking, this is Foreman's Smoked Salmon Factory, which many of you will know. And this final one is charity clothes sorting for charities to send clothes to Africa. And I produced a series of maps, two of which I'm going to show, that documented where businesses were. So trying to really capture the landscape of the site prior to compulsory purchase, given that it was shortly about to disappear in the form that it had been. There were 286 businesses, mostly SMEs in the original CPO. In the end, the process directly affected 207 businesses as a result of changes to the boundaries of that CPO area. There were 2,200 business, residential and community interests that were negotiated through the process. And then alongside that, as Penny touched on this morning, 1,500 residents, typically peripheralized groups such as travellers, two groups of travellers, social housing. There were also students of the University of East London there. And then there were cultural spaces such as a huge Ghanaian Pentecostal church, informal markets, along the gardens. This is the range. I'm not going to go through this because of time, but this is the range of firms on the site. So really very diverse. The bulk in manufacturing, but also waste management, construction, wholesale, as I showed, repairing motor vehicles. There was a lot of that. Some transportation and storage, food businesses. And then the photograph here was of the landscape. This was a kind of much maligned landscape of giant weeds, polluted rivers and soils, semi-wild and uncontrolled, growing up amongst the buildings and the cracks and the verges between fly-tipped tyres and once busy towpaths, captured here. And yet the pattern of materials in the map, as shown in the map, was telling of the way in which the site had developed historically at the edge of the city, and how it had remained a hybrid landscape, as the environmental geographer Jim Clifford has called it, at once a rural fringe of former commons, tidal rivers and marshes, and an urban periphery of industry, transport infrastructure and the like. And I produced some of these historical maps showing where common lands had been, and trying to understand how the rural landscape of the 18th century underlay the form that development took in the 19th century and beyond, and also considering the significance of city boundaries and other boundaries in the development of that urban topography. Trying to conceptualize it as an edgeland historically, and as layered through time, rather than a wasteland, which tends to flatten everything out. These are images from the site in the early 20th century, one from Furrier's G. Rice Limited, and the other one from the talcum filling department, which is part of the Yardley complex, perfume manufacturers. I guess we see these visual materials as coming together and to offer alternative ways of seeing the site, its qualities and its life as found, rather in the way that photographer Nigel Henderson approached the material culture of 1950s Bethnal Green, or as half a century earlier Eugene Atget captured Paris as it was rapidly modernising, drawing attention to the kinds of everyday places that in that context were also vanishing. So in the first part of the book, essentially we argue that it was not a wasteland. And in the next part we go on in search of its legacy contained in the spaces to which industries were dispersed, and in related accounts of that experience of dispersal, seeking to address how, as Mike Racco and Emma Tunney put it, once relocation has taken place, the focus of attention quickly moves on to what is then visibly created on prepared sites, i.e. the emphasis has been on physical transformation in the Olympic site. But what happened to all these people? Where did they go? How did they fare? What was legacy for them? And this is important because the LDA's relocation strategy in 2004 suggested that firms would not be put in jeopardy or harmed by relocation. Did this actually happen? So the first piece of analysis addressing these questions was this map, which took an extraordinarily long time to produce. And it looked at the 208 firms, and just tried to map out where they'd gone and broadly speaking what had happened. And it was quite interesting. 12% of the firms closed at that point in the context of the CPO. 9% were recorded by the LDA as locations unknown, and I couldn't trace them either. 7% left London altogether in a range of different directions, from as far north as Middlesbrough down to Kent. 72% stayed in London. So all the firms that closed were very small. They employed 5 or less people. And interestingly, in the interviews that I did around that time, it seemed that smaller businesses had found it much more of a struggle than some of the larger businesses to deal with the pressures of a CPO and the financial challenges that raised in particular. Jobs lost, it has to be said, were relatively small at that stage. There were 4,974 jobs on the Olympic site. 144 of those were lost through these closures. And then just a few reflections on this before I move on to the next map. To an extent, the diversity of locations reflects the LDA's aim and practice within the CPO of securing individualised relocations and settlements through negotiation with the businesses, aiming to find the sites that will be right for them. They also reflect the distribution of strategic industrial locations, as they're called, SILs, within the GLA's Industrial Capacity Supplementary Planning Guidance. Approximately 70% of firms relocated within London went to these kind of locations. They were distributed across London, but were particularly prominent in the Lee Valley, as you can see, the kind of band of blue there, and also the number of businesses along the waterfront in Newham and out in Dagenham and Barking, and then going out as far as Purfleet at the London border. Through these locations, the provision of industrial land as a strategic resource for London is regulated, ensuring that it can accommodate such functions as waste management, recycling, logistics, and transport activities, which are seen as, quote, essential to London's wider success and sustainability. Dispersal patterns hence also reflect a view that some kinds of businesses were less strategic than others. Approximately 23% of firms relocated within London were to sites of other industrial use outside the strategic industrial land framework. These sites may well have suited some firms and followed on from negotiation, but the larger significance of them is that they offered less long-term security, and I think that's going to be reflected in the next map that we'll see, which is this one, which is put together last year. So again, trying to follow up that same set of firms and seeing where they are now. 40 more firms have closed down in that period between 2008 and 2015, so 19% of the total. Added to the 12%, 31% of all those firms relocated have closed down since 2008. A further 8% have remained impossible to trace, so we can assume that they, have probably closed down too. Viewed in the wider context of business death rates across the UK, this is not a particularly high closure rate. It's not really remarkable. Closure rates across the UK in general were around 12% in 2009, reflecting the impact of the economic downturn following the 2008 financial crisis. However, looking at the map reveals some really interesting patterns in detail. 60% of firms relocated to Hackney closed in comparison to 12% in Enfield and 8% in Waltham Forest. And the closure statistics in Tower Hamlets, Newham, Barking and Dagenham were also pretty high, averaging around 30%, with Tower Hamlets and Newham higher in the high 30s in comparison to Barking and Dagenham. And there's a real kind of shrinkage in areas around the Newham waterfront in particular. Losses also occurred disproportionately across business types, which is interesting too. Among the manufacturers, the highest losses occurred within the printing industry, which accounted for 21% of all losses, including some quite large firms in that mix. The losses were more substantial during this year in terms of jobs, amounting to nearly 1,000, based on the size of those firms in 2008. Comparatively, some of the older firms, there were firms on the site that went back to the 19th century, showed more resilience than younger ones. Only one of those that closed was founded prior to 1930. Numerous factors affected these closures, of course, including broad structural forces impacting on London, lasting effects of the financial crisis, and different levels of facility within firms to adapt. Nonetheless, it would seem significant that the biggest losses occurred in Newham, Tower Hamlets and Hackney, as these boroughs are particularly affected by pressures to convert land to residential use and or to higher value industrial uses such as offices or business parks. With the value of residential land 10 times higher than industrial, this pressure is considerable, and planning policy has responded by releasing industrial land. I need to go back to that slide, to the map on the right there. As that map shows, which essentially shows that there's been a shrink back of the area that is designated for industrial land use. There are a number of areas that are no longer included in the framework of industrial locations, strategic industrial locations. They include parts of Hackney Wick, areas along the Newham waterfront, and then some areas, particularly within the Lee Valley, have been redesignated from industrial locations to industrial business parks, which implies higher value uses. So therefore, the suggestion of the original business relocation strategy that values around the Olympic site would be little affected by the redevelopment now seems rather far-fetched. Rather, urban policy and urban change more broadly would seem to be helping to continue to relegate industrial uses to the past and to ensure that predictions of decline in manufacturing actually come to fruition.
minutes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I've got just a little longer. Yeah. So this is borne out in the accounts we received from businesses themselves of how they had fared. We visited and photographed 10 at their new locations early last year, and we interviewed 18 in total. The image of the left is from one of our selection sheets. Again, there were hundreds of images to choose from, which is a whole process in itself. A few headlines from those interviews, given time constraints. Firstly, related to the CPO, how did people experience the process of engaging with that and with engaging with the LDA in negotiating? Key things were conflicts of vision, the difficulties for businesses in securing sites that worked for them, and hence in realising their own strategies or their own envisaged futures. The sense that relocation was a fait accompli in spite of the claim to be negotiating. The loss of opportunity for landowning firms to share in the benefits of regeneration by being able to develop their own land, which was one of the points made earlier. Issues of uncertainty and timing related to compensation, which impacted heavily on the less wealthy firms, in particular those smaller firms who felt that they didn't have the kind of capital reserves to enable them to wait out the period between submitting their claims and getting that compensation. And this is quite a nice quote that highlights that. Well, it wasn't nice for the person, for the firm that was experiencing it. I couldn't understand how some operation like that could just leave a smaller company like ourselves to just move and expect us to be able to pay according to the compensation code, which is spend the money first. But from my point of view, how can I incur the costs if I don't have the money to physically incur the cost? And so it was like a chicken and egg thing right throughout, and it started getting very, very difficult. And then there was also the timing of running a business and making a major move at the same time. Outcomes over the years up until 2015 were experienced very differently. Some firms certainly seem to have done better than others, from the move, from the negotiations, from the compensation. Firms that were landowners on the site, in spite of often feeling that they'd been at a disadvantage, and some of the established bigger firms seem to have done better than tenants, who often moved to sites where that were more precarious, effectively. And firms had adapted. All the stories that we received included elements of change, and firms spoke in some cases about how the relocation process might have facilitated adaptation more effectively. Some admittedly had reduced in size and scope, but others had diversified or specialised. And the images I include here are just two of the firms that, the older firms, one established in the 1880s originally and the other one established in 1905. Overall, I argue in the book that the experiences that some firms had of relocation seems rather consistent with the views of the site as a wasteland. And this was essentially that it did little to support or preserve them, particularly if they were not strategic, but rather viewed as part of the kind of declining manufacturing sector. And yet it seemed to me that firms themselves suggest that the decline narrative is too simple, that there are adaptive capacities and potentials for reinvention within industries and within industrial landscapes themselves, and that other approaches to development might have served them better. Thank you.
Thank you very much.